What happens when two parent coaches,
one a Christian
and the other an agnostic Jew,
sit down to talk about parenting?
They take their listeners from surviving to thriving.
I'm Deana Thayer.
And I'm Kira Dorian.
Welcome to Raising Adults,
a podcast brought to you by Future Focused Parenting.
Hello, FFPs. Kira and Deana with you again today for another episode of Raising Adults. We are both with you, but not both together. And so still missing each other, but really glad that we can continue to bring you content. And today we have an important episode where we have a guest today, Dr. Heather Maguire. She is a behavior analyst, a professor, and also a mom. And she's going to just share with us a little bit about how to navigate if you're in a family where maybe you have a child with a diagnosis. We're going to particularly talk about ADHD today, but a lot of these principles could apply more generally to other behavior or learning diagnoses. And so we look forward to sharing that with you, and we're glad to have Heather's expertise. Also, we want to let you know that by the time you're hearing this, we will have been on Heather's podcast, and her podcast is called Prism Parenting. So if you like getting to hear Kira and I elsewhere, you can check that out at the Prism Parenting podcast.
Yeah, we had such a good time talking with her both times. It was kind of fun getting to speak with her, close together, right? It was like we recorded ours and we recorded hers, and you know what I like about this episode is that a lot of the strategies that she talks about, I feel like even kids who maybe don't have anything behavioral going on, some of the stuff she talks about is really applicable. I feel like lots of parents are going to benefit from some of her strategies. So
that's really true. Thanks for saying that. That's an excellent point. So many of these things could be helpful in any home.
Yeah. All right. Well, let's get to the interview. So today on the show, we have Dr. Heather Maguire, who is a professor, a podcaster, and a mom, and she is going to talk with us about raising kids with ADHD. So Heather, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and those three amazing parts of you?
Yeah. First of all, thanks so much for having me on the show. Yeah, so I am a professor. I teach school psychology and school counseling classes, as well as I'm what's called a board certified behavior analyst, BCBA. Long story short, basically, I work with a lot of kids. Some of them have autism, and I provide behavioral strategies for them. And then also, I have my own podcast, Prism Parenting, and the basic idea behind like why I started it and what it is, it's basically trying to help parents, parents of, let's say, typically developing kids, or I know we're going to talk today about ADHD, parents of kids with ADHD. What does this look like? How can we use behavioral strategies, evidence-based strategies in the home, even if our kids don't say have a diagnosis of autism. So yeah, that's a little bit about me professionally. And then personally, I have two kids. Landon is my son. He is 9 in the 3rd grade. And then Addie is my daughter, Addison, and she is 6 in the 1st grade.
I'm wondering, Heather, can you maybe start at the beginning for us with the diagnosis piece? Because I think for parents, it's always challenging to get any kind of a diagnosis. And you're right at the beginning going, okay, now what? So can you tell us what that was like for you? And also, because you have this professional background, how did you go about tackling that when you have both of those hats?
Yeah. So let's talk about ADHD really quick. So first of all, and I think probably people are aware of this to some degree, but ADHD looks totally different depending on the child. So some kids are predominantly inattentive. They have a hard time focusing. And other kids have more of like hyperactivity and impulsivity, right? So it's hard for them to sit still. A lot of times it's hard for them to think before they act. And then some kids have what's called the, comorbidity or both of those things. Okay. And actually, so for my son, Landon, he wasn't diagnosed until this year. So he's 9 in the 3rd grade. And, professionally, even though I knew he had I knew he had ADHD, I've known for a while. We hadn't had him officially diagnosed. He wasn't diagnosed by a doctor until recently. And Real quick too, for him, just to kind of give you guys a little bit of context, he's not really inattentive. And actually the type that he has is that, so he's more hyperactive and impulsive. And that's the most rare form of ADHD. So how it impacts him on a daily basis is like this. He has a difficult time, like if he gets into an argument with his sister, he is the one who might become, aggressive, right, with his sister. He's the one who, if you ask him to do a chore, he might, all of a sudden, he lacks what's called emotional regulation. So he'll like fall on the floor. It's the end of the world. What? I have to feed the dogs. And I'm like, well, you do this twice a day. um, so yeah, ADHD, kind of like wrapping that part up, it looks different depending on the child, but for him, he's predominantly hyperactive impulsive. And definitely before I knew, that I had a son with ADHD, I already was a school psychologist. So I was working already in the field with kids with ADHD. And so as Landon started to get a little bit older, when he was younger, I was like, I knew there would be a chance maybe he'd end up with that diagnosis, but it started to become more obvious to me because, I mean, okay, let's face it, young boys, a lot of times they have a lot of energy. And I think for the parents out there who are listening to this, they might be like, well, my 4-year-old has a lot of energy. How do I know he doesn't have ADHD? Well, in the toddler years, there is a wide range of what's normal or what's considered developmentally appropriate, right? And so, but as time went on for us, basically what started to happen is that the gap started to widen. So, previously, yeah, was he a little bit more hyperactive, than the average kid? Sure. But then what started to happen is that, we started to notice that, other kids were kind of calming down and becoming a little bit more mature, if you will, and he was still struggling with those things. And so right from the get-go, come when we went into kindergarten, I being a behavior analyst, I reached out to his teacher and I was like, sometimes, Landon struggles sitting still. If there's anything I can do to support you, let me know. So I kind of, gave her a heads up. And we can get into like later some of the specific things that, we help the school with and what we do at home. But, initially I was like, oh, he's just a little bit hyperactive and I was keeping my eye on it. And then fast forward, I wasn't necessarily feeling like I needed a quote unquote diagnosis. I knew he had ADHD, but I wasn't feeling like I needed it until we started to consider whether or not we would potentially be requesting medication. And so my son is on medication. He has been on medication since this fall. And what we did is, I just reached out to his pediatrician. Now, just I don't know where you guys are at, or if but still most of the time pediatricians are making the diagnosis of ADHD. There are obviously neurologists, there are psychiatrists, things like that. Developmental pediatricians. There are other individuals making that diagnosis and prescribing medication, but still right now, the majority of the time it's the pediatrician. So for us, when I knew that we were going to most likely be, requesting and trying out medication, that was when we got the diagnosis through the pediatrician, and she was the one who prescribed the medication, if you will.
So, okay, so you, as a parent, you maybe start to see this gap widen. And I loved how you described that because I think that makes a ton of sense. Like, when they're little, we're kind of like, okay, well, a lot's normal. And then as it starts to, they grow and they develop and they change. If we're still suspicious, it's like we should be listening to that, I guess is what you're saying, right?
Correct. Yes.
So let's say that that gap has widened and I'm suspicious, and so you're saying like I would go to maybe my pediatrician and say, hey, here's what I'm seeing, what do you think? Is that like the next step for parents that are maybe like thinking
Yes, yes. So that's a good next step. And again, you're going to hear kind of a wide range of things. Some pediatricians aren't comfortable making the diagnosis or anything like that, but they'll give you, typically what they'll do is they'll at least do a screening. It's not a thorough screening, but pretty much all pediatricians will give you some sort of screening, and then they'll give you next steps, right? In terms of who you would meet with, to determine whether or not. And again, unfortunately, there isn't a, one size fits all approach, right? So in our case, they didn't do a comprehensive evaluation to make that diagnosis, right? But other individuals, other professionals will do a more comprehensive evaluation to make the diagnosis. But, there isn't actually a protocol that everybody follows. So in our case, um, our doctor made a pretty quick determination. Now, for me, I was comfortable with that because I already, knew professionally, I knew that he had ADHD. But, you could always, so for example, sometimes what happens is the school comes to you and they're like, oh, and they recommend that you meet with the pediatrician. And, if parents out there are like, well, I think that I would like, a more detailed or, thorough evaluation. There you could ask the pediatrician for referrals for that, to get that. Although, and I think you've talked about this before on your show. Those evaluations, if you get them done privately, they run several $1,000s typically. And so that could be, challenging. So like in our case, I was comfortable with it. I felt like it, our pediatrician was knowledgeable and she was able to take what I had to say into account. And so for us, it was a pretty quick process, but I think, like I said, it varies.
So I have a quick follow-up question. So if, you've because your route was a little different because of the work that you do. So as a parent without, your background, so I'm suspicious or the school comes to me, I go to my pediatrician, we get this, this is what we think it is, official diagnosis or not. So as a parent, if you were in a sort of traditional parent situation without your background, how do you think then parents make this decision between medication and not medication? Because I'm curious that you've done both. And I'm interested, like, as a parent who maybe doesn't necessarily have all those tools right away, what do you think? What should they be asking themselves? What should they be considering once they get this diagnosis for that then next step of do we medicate, do we not?
Yeah, and so I think that you kind of have to go through a few things and think about a few things. So first of all, ADHD oftentimes impacts kids socially. They have a hard time reading like the nonverbal cues because they're not picking up on them, they're not paying attention to them, and that's one of the things that I saw. My son was having a hard time socially, right? And so that's one of the things that I would suggest that you consider. How is your child doing socially? And by the way, what we ended up doing before, because we didn't just rush into medication, we tried a lot of different things first. One of the things we did is we did a social skills class. So unfortunately, insurance did not pay for it, but I found a place offering social skills groups, and so I enrolled my son Landon into that. But, so socially is one area because if your child is struggling socially, not connecting with others, that's going to have, a significant impact, right? I think all of these things, and I'll list a few others. I think you're thinking about like, what is the impact right now for my child? And, if it's a significant impact, then, are there resources I can try, different things I can try? And if not, then perhaps medication is something I want to consider, right? So socially is one thing. I think the other thing, so for us, I'll kind of tell you like the breaking point for me this summer. And we kind of had a hard summer. There were two moments for me where, it was kind of the breaking point. One, we were visiting family, and my mother-in-law's amazing. She plays like a ton with my kids and they have so much fun with her. And my son, they were doing something, and I think she told my son he had to get off of an iPad or something because she was going to go play with him, and he was aggressive towards her. And he loves his grandma, right? And he's, at this point, he's 8. And so, developmentally, 8-year-olds aren't usually striking their grandmothers, right? And so, he did not hurt her, but the aggressive behavior was very concerning. So that was one instance. And then there was another instance. And then, by the way, for him, immediately, he felt awful about it, right? You could tell like it was starting to impact his view of himself, if you will. He did not wanna be doing that. He loves his grandma. And then another thing, happened. For me, I don't know. Siblings can get a little bit, aggressive with each other from time to time, even at an older age, right? Siblings, not to say that that should be happening, but, it's a little bit less eye-opening. But another thing happened this summer. We were with a group of friends, and we're really close with these friends, and they have kids our kids' age, and we hang out all the time. So they're sort of like a second set of siblings, but they're not, right? And what happened was our friend's daughter was on a swing, a tire swing that my son wanted to get on, and she wouldn't get off. And again, he struck her on the back of the head, and then he felt awful about it, right? Immediately after. And so that impulsive behavior that he could not control, and that and of course there's consequences. I'm not to say, I was compassionate, but there were consequences. We talked about it. We took away a few privileges, things like that. But and we could talk about, things about discipline with kids who have ADHD later. But so I guess all that to say, for us, for our situation, it was starting to understand and consider this level of impact. And we were trying lots of things at home and at school, but it wasn't enough. And so I was starting to be concerned, kind of like the long term impact of, what my son was going to think of himself and how and whatnot. And so for us, that was kind of the breaking point. Now, he is not really inattentive, but for your listeners out there, in terms of level of impact, it could be, for example, that they're crying to you every night when they're trying to do their homework. They can't concentrate, or things like that. So, those are all like levels of impact where you're trying different things and just they're not working. And it's starting to have just kind of a large impact. At that point, I was starting to feel ready to try something else. And that's why, we thought about medication, because here's the deal. Using like proactive strategies is really helpful, but what the research says is that for many kids with ADHD, using, let's say, strategies and reward systems and things like that, they're helpful, but in and of themselves, they might not be sufficient for some kids with ADHD.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I'm I'm curious if you would be willing to share some of what you did in advance of getting to that point where you saw some kind of events that were the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, because I know there's probably families out there who maybe are at the beginning or just got a diagnosis and might want to try some other things first, or just want to set up their home in a way that could be helpful, before going to that or in addition to including medication. So are you willing to tell us a little bit about what you had done before this point or still do? I mean that's welcome as well.
Yeah, so I would definitely say, whereas medication can help, it wasn't the first thing we did, and I think that, parents out there trying a lot of proactive things before going to medication is definitely advised. So I like to think about it this way, like there's, in terms of behavior, your kids' behavior, trying like an 80-20 approach where you're doing, let's say, and putting in 80% of your effort into kind of the prevention side of things. And that can look, like a few different things. So things that we put into our home beforehand were these schedules. So my son thrives on a schedule. He loves a schedule. He loves to help create schedules. And schedules, lower anxiety, and they help. So, having a schedule in in the mornings and afternoons are very helpful. So just writing down a schedule, and again, having the child participate in creating the schedule will go really far because you want to increase buy-in and give back some of that control, right? You don't want to be like, here's exactly what you're doing. No, like together, let's develop a schedule of, let's say you come home and then you have snack and then we work on homework, then you have outside time, then this, that, and the other thing. So schedules can help a lot. um the next thing I want to say is that reward systems are really, really helpful. So reward systems look different at different ages. So at our home right now, with our kids who are in elementary school, we actually use what I would call like a quarter system, where our kids have piggy banks, and for certain activities, that, let's say, doing their homework without complaining, getting ready on time in the morning, things like that. So basically what we do is we write out specific things that we're working on, and our kids actually earn quarters every time they do those things. And then right now it's at the end of the month, but initially it was like at the end of the week. Basically they turn in those quarters. And by the way, we tried to make it so that there was, we're always trying to teach our kids about financial responsibility too. So that's one of the reasons why I like using quarters with kids in elementary school, because at the end of the month I had them put some in their savings account. We gave some away to our church, and then we had them spend some as well. So kind of like that, spending, saving, giving model. And so, just by using that, it's interesting. I'm not saying this is true for all kids with ADHD, but like with my son, he is just like really easy to motivate. He has his eye on the prize, if you will. He loves it. And my daughter's a little bit, she struggles with her behavior less, and she just kind of goes with the flow a little bit more. So, quarter system, she likes it, but my son is all about it. It's been very successful. For younger kids, by the way, you might use, let's say, a star system where, they earn. And by the way, the younger the child, the shorter the amount of time that should go by before they earn something, because they aren't able, to understand that what I'm doing now, I'll get a reward for it later. So you want to make it much shorter. But, it could be something simple. Um, uh, by the way, so one of the things I tell parents is like, we want to stay away from like, and it's funny because as we're recording this, Disneyland is closed, but, but, you want to stay away from those kind of like Disneyland type things where, you do these things and you get Disneyland. No, like good luck next time. So like once you've given away Disneyland, your kid won't want to work for anything but Disneyland. And so, no, but I'm being silly, but it could be something simple for the little kids. It's like, you get to have a certain treat. You get to watch a certain TV show. Or, I mean, you could even do something. What some parents do is they get like a bin, and they put some of their kids, like, some unique favorite toys that kids aren't that they don't play with except when they've earned, let's say, their stars. Okay, and then they get to play with this really cool bin of toys for a certain period of time, and then it goes up till the next time, right? So basically it's kind of like that scarcity principle where you increase the value of what it is they're playing with, so that they as long as so that they don't have access to it all the time, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. We talk a lot about like finding a kid's currency,
Yes.
and using that for both reward and for discipline. And so that's exactly it, right? Like, oh, you're almost creating currency that way.
Yes,
That's
yes.
super smart. I love that.
One thing I try to encourage parents to stay away from is this. So it's very tempting, and I mean, I've been there, okay, to start taking away quarters, let's say, like, "You did this, now I'm taking your quarter away." Actually, from a technical perspective, what you're doing then is you're basically turning your reward system into a punishment system, okay? And it's not to say that, there can still be, specific decided upon consequences for acting out, okay? But I always encourage parents to not incorporate, and different people might have different opinions on this, but to not incorporate punishment into their reward system. So, you might still use some sort of like time out or something if the child acts out, but try to stay away from taking away of quarters or stars or things like that, because then what happens sometimes is that you kind of like lose your kid's buy-in, if you will, to the system. And then they're like, I don't care, I don't want to earn quarters, I don't want to earn stars. So you want to keep that as positive as possible, um, so that you keep their buy-in, if you will. So one of the things that we did that was really successful too is that we incorporated our reward system at school as well. So even though Landon doesn't receive special education, and by the way, this year, him being on medication, he doesn't have a reward system at school. He doesn't need one. But in the past, we've had the teachers help with that reward system so that there's kind of like continuity at home and school, which is helpful.
Yeah. Oh, I love that he was able to get that continuity, and that makes perfect sense because then everybody's kind of working together to help him navigate this.
Yes, yes. It helped his teachers, actually change their behavior a little bit as well. So his teacher in kindergarten was a little frustrated with him and was kind of, being more punitive, if you will. But by me saying like, "Hey, let's work together with this reward system," it actually changed her behavior a little bit too, and she was much more positive with him, which I thought was really cool.
So I have a question for families that are most of us. um, we've been in this very unusual time with kids home for extended periods of time. And it's, April 20th is when this episode airs. So we will have been in that for quite some time. But I'm curious, are there any things that parents who have kids with ADHD should be doing or should not be doing while the kids are at home for this great length of time? Like you mentioned, a schedule. I assume they should try and create an at-home schedule to give them that support. Are there other things that parents can be doing that might look different because they have a child with ADHD at home?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I definitely think that, incorporating a schedule, incorporating a reward system is helpful. I do think it's kind of a unique period of time because I think socialization is super important, but it's socialization looks a little bit different right now, obviously. And so trying to create that continuity and structure for them, it might be, more, let's say, FaceTime meetings with friends, but, allowing them to still continue to have socialization, work on their social skills is important. I also think, involving others in their life. So, for example, what we're doing right now is that my son's grandmother meets them on Zoom and helps them with some of their academics every day as well. Since, being around people like grandparents is, we're not doing that right now, right? And so I think trying to find ways for them to socialize in a unique way, and then allowing those pillars in their life who they might not be able to see all the time, incorporating them into the schedule, it gives them a sense of purpose, and it allows gives takes some of the burden off of you as a parent to do everything, and allows us all to collaborate. I don't know, those are just two ideas off the top
Mm.
of my head.
No, those are great. Really, really helpful because this does look super different, and families need to have creative, I think, ideas of how to navigate it. I think we all have to get a little bit good at thinking outside the box right now. So that's wonderful. And please, 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 before we finish up, make sure to tell our listeners like where they can find you, your website, your podcast again, and all of those things so they can connect with you, social media handles if you have those. Just tell us how we can find you.
Yeah, well, first off, I have a great resource for all of your listeners. So they can go to prismbehavior.com, PRISM behavior.com /free guide. And they can actually download a resource where it walks you through kind of the basics of setting up a reward system with kids of different ages. So hopefully that will be really helpful. And then, yeah, my website is Prism Behavior. And on Instagram, I'm Prism Behavior. And then my podcast is Prism parenting.
Awesome. Heather, thank you so much for being with us today. I feel like a lot of our listeners who have children with ADHD are going to benefit a lot from this episode, but I also feel like parents with kids that don't have ADHD are going to benefit a lot from this episode. Like, so many great tips and tools, and just really appreciate your knowledge. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you, Heather.
No, thanks so much for having me. I appreciate it.
All right. Well, we hope that that proved helpful to you, whether you're dealing with ADHD, something else, or maybe not, and just needed a couple other strategies for consistency across home and school, whatever you might be facing. We're hopeful that there were some helpful nuggets that you could take away in there, and we're grateful that Heather took the time to speak with us. We did also want to remind you, listeners, that we've recently released our anxiety course. It's an online course all about navigating anxiety with children, although there's probably some tips adults can definitely use too. But we literally talk about everything from the science of anxiety to how to identify it in your children, what kind of things might you be watching for, all the way to some really helpful tools in terms of navigating that. What are things you should be doing? What are things you maybe should be trying to avoid as you help your anxious child or teen? And so we really recommend that to you, but we also want to recognize that not everyone has the bandwidth for taking in an online course right now. But if you are interested, if you go to our online courses tab on our website, futurefocusedparenting.com, you can find it there.
Yep. So be sure to check it out. I'm really proud of it. I mean, I'm proud of all of our courses, but this one just strikes a chord with me for some reason. I think it's really helpful, and I think there's a lot of parents out there that are looking for this right now. And so if we can be helpful, we want to be.
Anxiety certainly is an important and relevant topic right now, and we're seeing a lot of it in general, but also in young people. And so parents having the tools to navigate that, I think, is so important. So yeah, I'm really pleased with how it turned out, and we're excited to make that available to all of you.
Yeah, so don't forget to follow us on Facebook and Instagram at Future Focused Parenting. We've got lots of great stuff on social these days, and you do not want to miss it. And if you haven't yet subscribed to our podcast, please click subscribe. We love all of you subscribers and loyal listeners out there.
And then you don't miss any episodes, and that's so great too. You get all the stuff. So definitely hop on that subscription train if you haven't yet. Raising Adults is produced by Kira Dorian and Deana Thayer and recorded partially in Kira's laundry room and partially in Deana's bonus room. Music by Seattle band Hannah Lee. Thanks for listening.